NATO will not intervene in Ukraine. America has sent, just recently as last week, almost $300 million in humanitarian supplies. That means money to help Ukraine fight back Russia. But America cannot put troops on the ground in Ukraine. This becomes very, very important in the eyes of Putin, because NATO for the last 25 years has been trying to entrench or endraft Ukraine into NATO. Putin has strongly opposed that for a couple of reasons. Russia and Ukraine, these two neighbors that was once alliance under the USSR. If Ukraine becomes a part of NATO, then Ukraine becomes a military base for NATO. That means that NATO can put military operations in Ukraine, which is directly across the border from Russia. That makes Russia very, very vulnerable. All right, family, welcome to Studio B. I am your host, Pastor MDH. Thank you so very much for joining us here on the set today. We got a lot to talk about today. Today is going to be one of those kind of nerdy but very, very informative podcasts. I am going to explain to you in about an hour and 10 minutes about the whole Russia-Ukraine conflict and how we got to this point. You remember a month and a half ago, I sat right here on the set of Studio B and told you that there was going to be some conflict in Europe by Russia and Ukraine. And within the last week and a half, 2 weeks, Russia has done exactly what everybody thought they was going to do, and that is invade Ukraine. But I want to lay a foundation so that you understand how we got to this point, because nothing happens by happenstance. This is one of the things that I talk about a lot on this set, a lot in my life, a lot when I talk to people. You need to be informed. You need to be informed. You need to understand the ebbs and flows so that you make a intelligent decision before you dig your heels in the ground on any particular issue. Understand that issue as best you possibly can. But the problem is understanding the issue requires a whole lot of work and a whole lot of diligence and a whole lot of time in order to establish a framework to really base an educated decision on, or an educated stance on. And so it is with this Russian-Ukraine conflict. So I'm going to break it down into 3 different sections. It's not going to be exhaustive, but at the end of this podcast, I think you're going to have a much better understanding about how we are here. And watch this, if you are in America, how this affects you in your everyday life. Because you need to know this. This is a conflict that could turn into a biblical prophecy very, very quickly. So I want to give you one word. The Russia-Ukraine conflict is summed up into one word and one word only, and that word is geopolitics. Okay, Russia and Ukraine, the whole shebang, everything about it is summed up into one word called geopolitics. Now listen to this. Ukraine is the 4th largest country in terms of natural resources. The 4th largest country in the terms of natural resources. Ukraine is a little bit bigger than the size of Texas. It is a huge landmass in Europe. It is the 2nd largest producer of oil in the entire world. Talking about Russia and Ukraine, these two neighbors that was once alliance under the USSR. This is a huge part of the country that everybody in the world has their eye on. So it is the 2nd largest producer of oil in the entire world. That's Russia. If NATO sanctions Russia, which is what they're trying to do right now, here's what we know Vladimir Putin is going to do. He's going to put a death hold on the oil reserves. Once he puts a death hold on the oil reserves, Even though gas prices are now $3.15, $3.25 here in Houston, Texas, that's going to send the gas prices through the roof. And please hear this, it would not be out of the norm here in Houston, Texas, in the South, for you to see $5 a gallon within the next year. It is not out of the realm of possibility, considering that Russia is the second largest producer of oil in the entire world. It's a big deal. And so while America is placing sanctions on Russia, and NATO and its alliance countries are placing sanctions on Russia, Russia has some staying power too. Russia can just shut down its oil reserves and its natural reserves and make the entire world hurt. So this is a big deal, what's going on in Europe. I want to break this down for you in a couple of different things, because if you've been looking at the news for the last 3 weeks to a month, then you've been hearing this term NATO thrown all around. NATO this, NATO that. This is one of the reasons why, Vladimir Putin is doing this, because he hates NATO, and, America is a part of the NATO alliance, and we're going to cooperatively get together and we're going to stop the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. You've been hearing a lot about NATO, but I need you to understand what NATO is, because NATO plays an integral part in what's going on right now in Europe. An integral part. They are divinely connected to all of these things that are going on with Russia and Ukraine. So when we're talking about NATO, if you understand NATO, NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was founded after the Second World War in 1949. And it was founded to bring about peace in Europe. Mainly founded for two principal reasons. One, to stop the aggression of Hitler, and two, to stop the aggression of the USSR, which was a formidable opponent, especially during the Cold War of the USSR in America. So the NATO was formed in Washington, D.C. in 1949. When it was founded, it only had 9 principal members in it. But the whole purpose of NATO was collectively we are stronger than we are individually. Now, this was a European concept, because we in North America, we only got Canada and the United States. So there was no need or no aggression toward us in that particular manner. So NATO was mainly a European concept. So to gather all of its European alliances and bring them together into one room and say collectively between all of these nations, we are able to withstand than any one of us could do on their own. So that was the whole thing about NATO. And NATO said that we are able to fight collectively if any one person gets invaded. So this North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the main purpose was to guarantee safety and freedom for all of its members by political and military means. Now, NATO is actually headquartered in Brussels, Belgium. And when we're talking about political and military means, NATO itself does not have a military. It doesn't have an army. It doesn't have troops. It doesn't have weapons. What NATO forms its military around is by the military of the members involved in NATO. So when you collectively put all of the members of NATO together, they got about 3.5 million troops and a number of arms and all of these things that are going on with war. But NATO itself does not own any weapons or does not have any type of army. Now, NATO has 30 members. Now, again, this is nerd stuff, but you need to understand it so that when you're watching this stuff on the news, you're able to connect the dots between NATO and Ukraine and Lithuania, or Ukraine and Russia. Why do they matter? Ukraine and Georgia, Ukraine and Crimea. Why do they matter? Why do these names, why do these locations matter? NATO has right now in 2020, 30 members, 2 in North America and 28 in Europe. Now, I need to read these for you. The 30 members are Canada, Croatia, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Albania, Belgium, Bulgaria, Iceland, Luxembourg, Montenegro, the Netherlands, Italy, Lithuania, North Macedonia, Norway, Poland, Slovakia, United Kingdom, Portugal, Romania, and then finally the United States. Now, the United States is the juggernaut in NATO because the United States makes up about 22% of their budget. So the United States is a major player in NATO. So when America makes a suggestion within the halls of NATO, it carries a great weight because United States alone accounts for 22% of NATO's budget. By far the number one contributor of anybody in NATO that brings the most arms to bear, the most people to bear, and more importantly, the most money to bear. So in 1949, NATO was formed in Washington, D.C. as a buffer in Europe to stop the aggression of Hitler and to stop the aggression of the USSR. And for the first 40 years, all the way up until 1989, before the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO's main purpose was to secure peace against the USSR. Now, many of us on the other side of this camera right now, I being 48, when the USSR, the Soviet Union, when it collapsed in 1989, formed Russia in 1991, I was still in high school when this happened. Many of us remember the speech by Ronald Reagan when he says, "Mr. Gorbachev, let this wall fall." That was the fall of the USSR, or the Soviet Union. And if you go back to your history classes, you will remember that during the Cold War was mainly between two countries. It was between America and Russia, or modern day Russia, in that time, the Soviet Union. And when you're talking about the Cold War, you had two superpowers that had nuclear capability. And the nuclear capability was definitely on the table during the Cold War, because both sides were threatening each other with nuclear capabilities. And so the Cold War was a very, very, very big deal. At any given time, anybody from both sides of the coin could push a button and launch a nuclear strike. So the Cold War was a huge deal, and which was one of the founding reasons why NATO was enacted in 1949, was to buffer or to keep in check the USSR, or the Soviet Union. Okay? Because the Soviet Union, as it stands today, is non-existent. So when I say the Soviet Union, of course, I'm referring to Russia. Russia is a nominal country. Russia has the economy the size of Texas. Okay, so Texas, if you didn't know, it has the fourth largest economy in the entire world. So Texas, in and of itself, is a huge economy similar to that of Russia. But when you're looking at the USSR in the Cold War days, the USSR expanded over all of Europe. Okay, but there was something that happened with Russia is when they went to war in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan bankrupted Russia, which is how they lost territories. They went in there and they underestimated those Afghan fighters, and for 10 years got their hats handed to them until eventually Russia had to retreat out of Afghanistan. That particular war bankrupted Russia and led to the ultimate fall and dismantling of its economy. And it was a very, very big deal. It was a huge deal. Russia actually ran out of Afghanistan with their tail between their legs, because those Afghan fighters they completely underestimated. I'm going to come back to that in just a little bit. So NATO has been bound by its military power since 1949, due to which today we already talked about 3.5 million soldiers, personnel, and civilians. And because of its alliance, all the members definitely contribute in one way or another. So here's what NATO's main purpose is. NATO says all of the 30 members here, you're good. Lithuania, if somebody attacks you without cause, then we, the other 29 members of NATO, are going to come and fight right beside you. Notice that when 2001 hit, when 9/11 hit America, and we had to go to Afghanistan and Iraq, we had allies, every last one of these countries. Every last one of them in NATO. They were forced. They had to play the hand that they were dealt because there was an attack on American soil. Outside foreigners had attacked us from inside of our borders. We went to war. Everybody in NATO had to then go to war with us. So regardless of whether or not they believed in what we were doing, they were bound by the contracts of NATO to go to war with us because somebody from the outside attacked us from within. So this is very important that you understand, because NATO, the principle, which is called the saucer of NATO, just recently said, just last week, that NATO will not intervene in Ukraine because it can't. Because Ukraine is not a part of NATO. So they said, regardless of what's going on, it's wrong, it's this, it's that, we as NATO cannot directly get involved with what's going on on the ground in Ukraine because Ukraine is not a part of NATO. Now, America has sent, just recently as last week, almost $300 million in humanitarian supplies. That means money for medical equipment, military equipment, guns, and the so on, to help Ukraine fight back Russia. But America cannot put troops on the ground in Ukraine. Neither can Canada, neither can France, neither can Germany, neither can Czech Republic or Hungary or Albania or any of the 30 members in NATO. They cannot put their military personnel on the ground in the Ukraine because Ukraine is not a part of NATO. This becomes very, very important in the eyes of Putin, because NATO for the last 25 years has been trying to entrench or endraft Ukraine into NATO. They have been trying to get Ukraine into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But I was getting ready to say Biden. Putin has strongly opposed that for a couple of reasons. Because if Ukraine becomes a part of NATO, then Ukraine becomes a military base for NATO. That means that NATO can put military operations in Ukraine, which is directly across the border from Russia. That makes Russia very, very vulnerable. Now, please hear this. When you're looking at Russia, most people look at Russia on this circular globe that many of us got spinning in our office, and we think Russia is like 55,000 miles away from us. It is not. Russia is 3,000 miles to the east of Alaska. It is not very far. As a matter of fact, I can get to Russia quicker than I can get to Africa. It is not halfway around the world. When you look at a flat map, you will see just how close Russia is to the United States, just how close Russia is to Canada. It is very close. Less than 3,000 miles, as a matter of fact. So when you're talking about this thing called Russia, and Russia being a nuclear superpower by which Putin has put his nuclear forces on alert last Thursday. And please hear me about Putin. Putin is worth $200 billion. This man is the third richest person in the entire world. He is a former head of the KGB. He's been the leader of Russia for the last 24 years. He is well entrenched, and he is one of these kind of guys, like a Russian mobster, like the ones you see on TV. That's Putin in real life. Like, Putin don't give two hoots about nobody. And the interactions between us and Russia and America over the last 25 years have been up and down, to say the least. But Putin just solidified a partnership that everybody needs to be aware of, and we'll get to that in just a second. So in understanding this little conflict that's going on in Europe, you need to understand how this thing all came about. Okay. And this thing came about by a whole lot of ebbs and flows, and the pieces eventually coming into play. Of all the NATO members, only 3 of them have nuclear capabilities. That's the United States, that's France, and the United Kingdom. Only 3 of the 30 in the NATO alliance have nuclear capabilities, meaning that they can drop atomic bombs. nuclear war. And nuclear war will wipe everybody out. Only 3 of them have them. That's the US, that's France, and the UK. But when you're talking about nuclear capabilities, there's also somebody that has nuclear capabilities. And not just nuclear capabilities, everybody, but he has a well-advanced nuclear capabilities. Russian scientists are some of the smartest in the entire world. So it's not that he's got, duct tape and super glue. He's well advanced in his technological abilities to make nuclear weapons, which they have active and ready to fire. So in response to all of what's going on here, NATO has been put in a very, very interesting position. Because NATO knows that it can't do anything lest it violates its own statutes. They know that they can't send military personnel into Ukraine. And as I speak today, Russia is about 20 miles outside of the Ukrainian capital. Matter of fact, they've already started throwing shells at the Ukrainian capital. They've already captured the second largest city in Ukraine. The only thing that is slowing down the force of this advancement from Russia is that Russia has a volunteer army. Now you have to sign up for the army in Russia from ages 18 to 21. After that, you're a volunteer. So as you've been looking on the news, there have been several Russian troops that are simply just putting down their guns and walking away. And they can do that without any recompense because they are over the 3 years that they are required to serve in the army. That's why it was very, very strategic for Putin to put these new enlistees on the front lines of battle that are still within their 3-year mandatory sentence. But you see a lot of Russian troops that are simply just putting down their guns, getting out of armored tanks and walking the other way. So the advancement has not gone as well as Putin would have thought. But I need you to hear this. Putin, once he unleashes all the capabilities that he has, taking nuclear deterrence off the table, right now he has a 17-mile convoy of tanks and armored personnel waiting 20 miles outside of the capital. 17 miles. 17 miles. I'm going to tell you how bad it is in Ukraine. The president, Mr. Vladimir, has issued a decree to all of age Ukrainians where they are arming of age Ukrainians, female and males, giving them AK-47s. They are arming their citizens. As a matter of fact, Vladimir Klitschko and his brother, the 2 heavyweight champions here in America, they are Ukrainian. They flew back to Ukraine and joined the army. Okay, now I'm going to say something about that in a little bit later. But Ukraine is giving every of age person an AK-47 and telling them to come and fight on behalf of their country. I'm going to tell you something about that in a little bit because that's an important thing that you need to understand. So when you're talking about Ukraine, why is Ukraine so important? It is a huge landmass that literally connects Eastern Europe. It is a huge strategic place that if you have it, puts you in a better advantage against all of your neighbors. But there is a point in which you got to remember that Ukraine and Russia were actually one. They were one nation or one republic. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine went this way and Russia went that way. But in Eastern Ukraine right now, you have a lot of native Russians. So all of Eastern Ukraine, they speak native Russian. So not everybody is like, okay, I don't want Russia over here. You have a lot of people in the Donbas area that are welcoming Russia to come in. Now, the large majority of the people in Ukraine do not want that advancement. And many of us have seen the mortars going into apartment buildings and busting up restaurants, and people, 500,000 Ukrainians are fleeing their country even right now. But Ukraine and Russia were at one point in time united. They were a part of the same republic called Russia, or the USSR. Okay. And so when you're talking about when Putin gets on TV and he makes his speech to his people and he tells his people, well, what I'm doing is natural because Ukraine is actually a part of Russia. And historically, he's true. But just like any dictator will do, they pervert the truth. They put a little bit of the truth in there and surround it with a bunch of lies. But historically, he's true that Ukraine and Russia were at one time together. But he leaves out some very, very key details. But I want you to understand something. Everything that you see right now, you peel it all the way back, and it all has to do with money. It's all got to do with power. And many of us that are going to work every day, 40, 50 hours, trying to do the best that we can, trying to raise our families, trying to do this, trying to do that, we don't live in that stratosphere. We don't live in that stratosphere. So it's very, very difficult for us to understand those kind of things that are happening in the world right now. But let me give you a couple things here. When Ukraine and Russia were one, this was during the time of the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, there was also a time when Ukraine and America were staunch adversaries. During the Cold War, one of the biggest adversaries in particular was Ukraine to the United States. Why? Because the Ukraine held all of the nuclear weapons. Ukraine had all of the nuclear weapons, all of them. And they were pointed toward the West. So when the talks of the Cold War between us and the Soviet Union, most of those talks took place in Ukraine, not in Moscow, because that's where the military surplus was held during the Cold War. But in the 1900s, where the Ukraine in the early 1900s was a powerful superpower. And when you took in that, I've had the chance, by God's grace, to visit Europe on a number of different occasions. I've never been to Russia, even though I have some military friends that are in Moldova. And Moldova is to the south of Crimea. As a matter of fact, 3-4 years ago, I had a couple come and tour the facilities, and they were missionaries to America from Moldova. He said Russia, but it's not Russia. It's actually Ukraine. But they were missionaries from Moldova to America, which was, a strange thing. But they came down here to evangelize Americans. And we're going back to the Ukraine in the next coming months. I've since lost touch with them, but I believe that they had abatement. Let me not get into that because I don't want to mention their names. But anyway, they were coming down here to evangelize America from Moldova, which is on the corner of Ukraine. Now, here's the thing about the Ukraine. It had defense industries, large agricultural lands, and housed much, much, much of the Soviet nuclear arsenal during the Cold War. And that's what made Ukraine an arch rival of the United States. So when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Ukraine became independent, as did Russia. However, Ukraine inherited much of the nuclear arsenal, but gave it back to Russia in 1994. So in 1994, Ukraine handed over all of its nuclear arsenal that they had had since 1991, when Ukraine and Russia split and became independent of one another. But in 1994, Ukraine gave all of the nuclear arsenal back to Russia. In exchange, Moscow guaranteed the Ukraine security and promised to respect its sovereignty. And this is what they signed. They signed the Budapest Memorandum in November of 2013. So Russia said, give us our nuclear weapons and we will respect your sovereignty and your security. But give us back our nuclear weapons. And they did. Many conceded that was not maybe such a good move from the political leaders of his day. But when you're talking about Ukraine, when I was doing the research, and I've been doing the research on this for the last few weeks, bits and pieces here, looking at stuff here, doing the stuff that I do, the nerd kind of stuff that I do that I love to do, I was very, very intrigued when I found out about the intricate relationship of Ukraine and America. Now, just allow me just a couple of minutes here. When the Warsaw Act was signed during the Cold War in mid-1940s, don't quote me on that. It's in the 40s. Maybe it's in the early 40s or the late 40s. So I'm going to say mid just to stay safe. The Warsaw Act was a peace treaty that was signed by 9 different nations for ceasefire. Those of us living in 2022 don't really understand how close we came to it all ending in World War II. Like, it was a big deal. It was a big deal. Now, of course, America is the only country that has ever dropped a nuclear bomb. Okay, we're the only persons that have ever dropped an actual nuclear bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Many of us remember that in response to Pearl Harbor. However, there have been nuclear attacks, not on that scale, but on much smaller scales. There's a very real possibility about nuclear fallout, especially as we get more and more technologically savvy. Right now, America, and this is a modest estimate because nobody really knows the real numbers, has over 50,000 nuclear missiles, like all around America. And we don't know the exact number, but America is a nuclear super power. So we don't have to take bombs up in planes anymore and drop them out. Now, those things launch out of the ground now, and they're everywhere. That's a nuclear deterrent. So that tells anybody that if you're getting too frisky, just know we got some stuff that'll end it all. That's a nuclear deterrent. And we got a lot of them. But there's also some people that's got some nuclear deterrents, not to our level and to our scope, but have nuclear deterrents. And here's the thing, their nuclear deterrents and their biological deterrents are much more subtle. If you remember about 15 years ago, a little bit after 9/11, we had a whole lot of anthrax scares, a whole lot of them, showing up at the Capitol building, being mailed to people's houses, just a little white powder. Just a little white powder that, when exposed to the elements, when taken out of its container, could kill you. Biological warfare. You can put it in an envelope. You can take it to the middle of Times Square and just throw it up in the air. It's a deterrent. It's a biological deterrent. Not a big old bomb that's shooting out of the air, but something that can be placed in an envelope and shoved in your pocket. Things have changed over the years. We have people that are wearing suicide vests now, going into middle of crowded buildings and crowded shopping malls. Things have changed so much within the last 20, 30 years, where the threat of war is not just troops on the ground or an invading army, but the things that can happen outside of that are much more subtle. And so we have to be very, very diligent about making sure that we are crossing our T's and dotting our I's. And make no mistake about it, the West is not liked by a lot of developing countries because of our culture. And so there's a lot of hate and vitriol that is aimed our way in the West. But I need you to hear this, because this is important. When you're talking about war, and this could not, I'm only giving you these facts and these are facts that you can research for yourself, is to educate you, not to scare you. Okay? Matthew chapter number 25 says that there will be wars and rumors of wars. But then he goes on to say the end is not yet. So it's not to scare you in any way, shape, or form. It's not. However, if you're simply looking at the trajectory of the world, you see us going in a place that can be very detrimental, hear this, for all. I want to show you a couple things why. There's a member of NATO that has been very, very vocal and have been placed in a very, very vicarious position. And that is the country of Germany. Germany, economy-wise, is a big player in NATO. But Germany is in a very, very unique position because 50% of all of Germany's energy comes from Russia. 50% of all their natural gas, of all of their energy, comes from Russia. As a matter of fact, for the last 20 years, they have been building direct pipelines from Germany to Russia on the outskirts of the Ukraine. So Germany is in a position right now to where it's a part of NATO. Russia is invading the Ukraine, but Germany is getting 50% of its energy from Russia. How did that happen? Well, 20 years ago, the environmentalists won. They decommissioned all of their nuclear reactors. They thought that nuclear reactors were bad for the environment. Obviously, they've never went to a science class. So now 50% of their energy is dependent upon an invading country. So you think they're going to stand up and say, hold on, Russia, don't do that? No, because they're too invested in Russia for them to stand up against Russia. Economics. 50% of their natural gases are coming from Russia. Now, to further put this into a easy to kind of navigate perspective, I want to talk about why this is important to the money. If many of us should remember when Putin annexed Crimea in 2014. It was a big deal. It was a big deal. If you remember anything, that was when Obama was terribly upset that Putin had the audacity to go into Crimea and annex Crimea into Russia. In 2014, when he annexed Crimea into Russia, he did that for a military and strategic reason. Okay, because Crimea is a peninsula right off of the borders of Ukraine. This stuff has been in the works for a long time in Putin's mind. It's been in the works a long time. It's not just something that happened in the last couple of months. So he annexed Crimea in. Crimea is a peninsula on the southern part of Ukraine, and he did that for military and strategic reasons. So Crimea is a part of Russia to this day. They have military bases in Crimea, okay, and military personnel in Crimea, very, very strategically placed there by Vladimir Putin, because he saw what he was going to do when he was eventually going to invade Ukraine. And so he was just simply putting the chess pieces in place for the eventual attack that he was going to launch on this nation. Ukraine has 44 million people, has a GDP of $150 billion. Ukraine is not some slouch of a country, where people are living in caves. It's not in Afghanistan. It's not in Iraq. It is a developed country with clean running water, with very successful people, with businesses, with schools and universities, and all of the things that we like in the West, they got in Ukraine. It's just like a million times colder. But it's not some undeveloped country. It is a very developed country and a very strategic country for all parties involved. All of them. All of them got their eyes on Ukraine. But the ones with common sense understand that I can't invade it. I can't take it by force. But make no mistake about it, everybody's got their eye on Ukraine. When we talk about, when I was sitting there listening to, who was I listening to? There's somebody on CNN. Well, anyway, I found it very interesting that America is taking a position that it is. I want to share with you a couple things. Once upon a time, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia signed a deal for oil trade in U.S. dollars early in the 1950s, 1960s. A few decades later, Saddam Hussein decided that he wanted to trade oil trade in euros. Follow me. The United States and Saudi Arabia, which is the first producer of oil in the entire world, signed a deal that we were going to do oil trade in U.S. dollars. That the U.S. dollar was going to dominate the oil. And that's how we were going to trade. It's through U.S. dollars, which added value to the U.S. economy, to the U.S. dollar, which in turn buffered or built up the U.S. economy. Okay? Because you do know now that the U.S. economy, the U.S. dollar, is no longer backed by gold. A few decades later, Saddam Hussein decided that he wanted to make oil trade in euros. Well, everybody knows that the euro is more valuable than the dollar. So that's just a business move. So Saddam Hussein said that if I trade oil in euros as opposed to dollars, then I'm going to make more money. Watch this. Immediately after that, 2 months after Saddam Hussein decided to trade oil in euros, America invaded Iraq for supposed weapons of mass destruction that to this day we still can't find. Y'all remember the Senate hearings when Colin Powell showed pictures and graphs and all of that stuff and said these are the weapons of mass destruction, to which many were like, why are we going after Saddam Hussein for 9/11 when we know that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11? But we invaded Iraq, ironically, after Saddam Hussein said we want to trade our oil in euros. It's a huge deal. Follow the train. Not very long after that, Gaddafi. Y'all know who Omar Gaddafi is. He was the president of Libya. He decided to do his oil trade in gold and was attempting to unify Western African nations. NATO stepped in, led by the United States of America, with military strikes, thus killing Gaddafi by armed rebels. Now watch this, turning Libya today into a failed state for ISIS. The #1 place in the world for human trafficking is Libya. The #1 place in the world for terrorist training is Libya. The arms that are found all around the world are coming from stockpiles in Libya. But it just happened to be that the United States and NATO led military strikes against Libya after Gaddafi decided to go oil trade with gold. And to this very day, Libya is an ISIS state, a failed state. To this day, nobody said a thing. Libya is not part of NATO. Libya didn't invade anybody. Why was Libya taken out? Let's bring this home. Early February 2022. Just this February. Here's the breaking news. Bam, 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 lights are flashing. Russia and China signed a deal to supply them gas and settle in euros. Russia, this was on February the 13th. 2022, signed a deal to supply them gas and natural resources, but to settle that in euros. The next day, February 14th, Valentine's Day, the next day, the United States clears a $300 million defense budget to help Ukraine. The next day, after Russia and China sign a deal to supply gas and settle in euros, not American dollars, but euros, $300 million goes straight to Ukraine. The next day. But watch this. Putin, just before he invaded Ukraine, regulated Bitcoin as a currency in Russia. Just before he invaded Ukraine, he regulated Bitcoin as a currency in Russia. Very easy to do. So now what he can do is shift his money from his natural resources, by which they're trying to go after all the European banks, sanction Russia on the SWIFT system, which is a cross-border banking system, seizing his money. If you think that a $200 billion man has just money laying around in open accounts in banks all over the world, you're crazy. But he sanctioned or regulated Bitcoin as a currency right before they invaded Ukraine, days before. Why is this important? Because what's happening over there is going to affect you here. There's going to be a trickle down effect. In the same way as Ukraine is but it's arming all of its citizens that are of age, male or female, with AK-47s, telling them to fight on behalf of their country. This is very interesting because in 2010, Ukraine passed some of the strictest gun laws that Eastern Europe had ever seen. And now they're giving guns away to tell people to fight on behalf of their country from a tyrant. What does that mean for us in America? You guys know that I'm a Second Amendment guy. I believe in the Second Amendment, that the Second Amendment was given to push back tyranny domestically and internationally. That when the citizens are disarmed, it makes that nation, that country, more vulnerable. A mass murder with a gun is not going to go into a place where he knows everybody else has got guns. So what happened in Ukraine? They made a mass call out. Everybody that is of age, come down here. We're going to give you an AK-47 because we need you to fight on behalf of your country. And so they gave it out. All you had to do was complete 5 hours of training. This happened in Ukraine. But Ecclesiastes chapter number 3 says this: there is nothing new under the sun. What has happened has already happened. There's nothing new under the sun. Everybody, life is cyclical. Okay? The markets are cyclical. Okay? Whatever is happening right now, this is not the first time that it's happened. You just got to know history to know how to respond in the present. If you don't know history, then you'll make mistakes in the present. You got to know history, what happened in history, how did they respond, look at the pros and the cons, and then make appropriate decisions about how you're going to respond. This could lead to World War III. Because watch this, NATO is begging. They got the carrot and they are telling, watch this, they are telling Putin, man, just step foot in Estonia. Estonia was a part of the Soviet Union. Just step foot in Albania. Albania was a part of the Soviet Union. Just step foot in Bulgaria. Bulgaria was a part of the Soviet Union. Lithuania, step foot in Lithuania. Lithuania was a part of the Soviet Union. So was Slovakia, so was Romania. Now, Lithuania is right there on the boot of Ukraine. If any one of Putin's troops puts his foot anywhere in Lithuania, 30 countries get involved immediately. if he even remotely goes anywhere near these 9 countries that are bordering Ukraine and even sneezes at them wrong, it's going to incite a response from all 30 members of NATO, including the United States of America. That's what's at stake. That's what's going on right now. Make no mistake about it. War is profitable. Right now we have, I think today the number was 514. As I'm recording this now, 514 people have died, civilians and military personnel. 514. But make no mistake about it, they are begging Putin to come across that border. Now, what's going to now listen, again, not to scare you. Don't go hiding in your basement. Don't do that. But what does this mean ultimately in the grand scheme of biblical prophecy? Well, we know that there's going to be a mass war that's going to happen in the Valley of Megiddo by 2 major players that are able to produce almost 200 million foot soldiers. We know this. This is in Revelation 13 and 14. We know this is going to happen in the Valley of Megiddo. Russia is trying to revive the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union. Okay, what does that mean? Well, I'll tell you what it means. If Russia and China get on the same page, because they both have mutual interests, which is world domination. That sounds like a movie, doesn't it? That somebody is trying to conquer the world. But always remember this, absolute power absolutely corrupts. I understand it. It sounds like a movie. In a lot of different ways, I can see how this is playing out like a movie, but the pieces are being put in place right now. And so as we are sitting around in America talking about stuff that at the end of the day don't matter, here's what they're doing in China. In the 1st grade, all Chinese children learn algorithms. I said that right. In the 1st grade, they're teaching algorithm courses in China. That's what's happening right now in China. The young men in China and in Russia are strict disciplinarians. They are brought up in a strict, disciplined way in China and in Russia. The young men. If you go to China right now, you won't be able to find a man dressed like a woman with lipstick on social media. They're banned. No feminized women, no feminized men have been allowed to do social media platforms. They have an entire branch of their government where they do nothing but monitor that. And while we're sitting around giving 5-year-olds hormone pills and arguing about pronouns, what's going to happen as we need to rebuild our own military forces? What happens when that 5-star general that's been in the United States Marines for the last 30 years of his life decides to retire? What men are we going to have to be able to replace these men that are rolling off into the sunset? Again, not to scare anybody, but you need to understand the chess pieces are being put in place for something to happen. Will it happen? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if Bitcoin is going to be the lead to the one world currency. I have no idea about that stuff. I'm not a believer in Bitcoin at all. I mean, I don't like it. It's not something that I hold to. but I don't know where that stuff is going. I just try to make sure that I know as much as I possibly can in order to make some very informed decisions. And history will tell us about what happens. So as you guys are watching the news, as you guys are seeing this stuff unfold, as you are watching, unfortunate bombs being dropped in this place and being dropped in that place, it's discouraging to see. It is. One of the things that I'm doing for my fast right now is I'm praying for that conflict. Praying for that conflict to be resolved. But I understand that there's so many different moving pieces in this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and it's much more than what is being reported. Lastly, I want to bring something to you. I want to bring to your attention the role of history. History in 1918 to 1920, we had a severe outbreak of influenza in the United States of America. For 2 years, we had a severe pandemic in America with the outbreak of influenza. 4+ million people had died, including a lot of soldiers. That's 1918 to 1920. What followed that was the 1929 to 1933 Great Depression. That's when the stock market crashed. The Great Depression lasted for 4 years. After the Great Depression, World War II came, 1939 to 1945. So I want you to see this. Pandemic, depression, war. Pandemic, depression, war. Pandemic, depression, war. 2020, we entered into the COVID-19 space. 2020 to 2022 is still going on to this day. Mid-2020, the markets began to fall. Recession hit everywhere, especially in undeveloped countries. And if you listen to any financial person worth their salt, they'll tell you that there's a real chance for a crash, a depression. There's a real chance for it. What precedes a depression? Inflation, high prices. That's what comes before the depression. Inflation, high prices, cost of living going up. So what happens when you hit a depression? There's no money. And the money that is out there is not in circulation because people don't know when the depression is going to end. Therefore, they're not as willing to spend that money. So they hold on to it longer. They don't invest in stocks. They don't invest in markets or tangible stuff. They hold on to the cash. What does that do to the economy? That is contingent upon home buying. That is contingent upon people buying cars. That is contingent on people buying new shoes, new clothes, this, that, or the other. The economy begins to suffer. How do you get out of a depression? The same way you did in 1933. What got us out of the depression? World War II. If you know anything about history, you know Boeing that's when Boeing made its splash into the market. So when you're looking at history and how history duplicates itself, Ecclesiastes chapter number 3, we need to be aware of that stuff going on in Europe. Everybody listen, you need to be concerned about paying. Now I'm in Houston, Texas, about paying $3.20 a gallon. Now in California, y'all on a different planet. Y'all paying $6 a gallon right now. It's crazy. But you need to be concerned that inflation has gone up to 7.25%, the highest in 44 years. Everything is up. Everything. You need to be concerned about that. That's not just something that Christians say, well, God's going to provide. I know that. I know God will provide in feast or in famine. I get that. But you need to be aware of these things so that you are making the best decisions possible. Because if history is correct, which it normally is, the cycle will show itself again. Now, again, is this to scare you? No, of course not. You know, my role here on the set of Studio B is to inform you and to give you the best information possible so that when you turn this podcast off, you are more informed than when you turned it on. I am saying to us, we need to understand what's going on in the world as opposed to a 5-minute news clip. And all of these things that are meant to get us off kilter from what really matters. We should be concerned about what's going on in Russia and in Ukraine and in Europe and with NATO. We need to be concerned about that because it will affect us. It will affect us. Now, I'm not a prophet, nor do I play one on TV, but let me tell you what's going to happen. If Russia does gain control over Ukraine, they can gain control over it, but keeping control over it is going to be an entirely different measure. But let's just say that they gain control of Ukraine. Here's what's going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years. Mark my words, guarantee it. China is going to invade Taiwan. And China is going to capture Taiwan, as China has long since wanted to do for 50 years, 40 years. It's going to do if Russia overtakes Ukraine. China is going to put together a military campaign and try to overtake Taiwan. You heard it here on this podcast. In the next 3 to 5 years, you're going to start seeing the ramblings that's going to be happening between China and Taiwan. Now, China nor Taiwan are part of the NATO. But please hear me. Please hear me. America is deeply entrenched with China. Because a lot of the goods that we enjoy here in America, guess where they come from? Just look on your clothes. Look at your couch. Look at your TV. Look on the back of it. It says made in China. Or made in Taiwan. You're going to see this start to happen. And so everybody, as you're looking at what's going on in Russia with the Ukraine, I wanted to dedicate the entire podcast to it. The entire podcast to it. Because there is nothing new under the sun. Nothing new under the sun. Nothing new under the sun. So we need to be informed. We need to be prayerful, but we need to be informed about what's going on in the world because eventually that stuff's going to get to your doorstep. And as I've always told you, that the stuff that they write down, the policies that they pass, the laws that they enact, eventually it may seem like it doesn't matter to you, but eventually it's going to work its way down to your doorstep. After I leave today, going on lunch, me and my wife, we didn't have the opportunity to go and early vote, but we will be doing that today with the candidates that'll be on the ballot today. So we will make those votes count, and I ask that you make your votes count. I wanted to dedicate this entire podcast to this issue because one of my deepest, not deepest ones. I don't want to, dramatize this thing, but I really wish one of the things that we would do in church is educate our people in the political realm. And I'm not talking about from a red or blue perspective. I'm talking about the issues and how they directly affect you. From Genesis to Revelation, faith and politics merge. Okay? Moses went before Pharaoh, the king of his day. politician of his day. Elijah stood before Ahab, the king of his day. David was a king, politician. Solomon was a king, a politician. Jesus went before Pilate, the Roman governor. Jesus had interactions with the Pharisees, politicians. Paul was given a death sentence and had his head cut off by a politician named Nero. So one of the things that I wish we would do better in the church is have informed political discussions, not where we're throwing bottles at each other and cursing each other out, but understanding the issues so that we're able to make informed decisions. Because I think a lot of Christians bury their head in the sand when it comes to politics. And you don't want to be involved in it because it's too divisive. I get that. But you can't let it be divisive. Because this stuff is going to reach your house. It's already reaching mine. Okay. Lastly, let me share. I told my wife this morning, or last night. I've calculated that the rise in fuel costs, gas at the gas pump, in my house, I will spend an additional $2,400 a year. $2,500 a year because of the rise in gas prices. I've already calculated that out. Okay, it costs me $94 now to fill up my truck. I have a Suburban, my wife has a Tahoe. It costs me $71 to fill up hers. It cost me $94 where it used to cost me $65. That's a $30 difference. That's a $30 difference. Does that stuff matter? It sure does. You know what I could do with an additional $2,500? A lot. So when we talk about stuff like this, here's what I always tell you. Eventually, it's going to get to your doorstep. Eventually. May not be tomorrow, may not be next month, but it's coming to your doorstep. That's why I'm encouraging us to know what you're talking about, to know the issues that are on the table, to know them and make some informed decisions. Pray for what's going on in Europe, because we ain't seen nothing yet. So, everybody, thank you. From the depths of my being, thank you for supporting us the way that you do here on the set of Studio B. We truly, really appreciate all that you do. It is my deepest prayer and my deepest preparation that when you turn off this podcast, you are better than when you turned it on. And so I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for those who support, those who comment, those who like, those who subscribe, those who share. You make this possible, and we are greatly appreciative of your viewership and your followership. So everybody, we love you so much. Remember, if God be for you, it's more than the entire world against you. And remember, when the enemy comes in like a flood, God will raise up a standard against them. You are better with God than you are without him. Trust him in all things, even the things that you can't understand, and watch him do great things in your life. Until next week, we'll see you then.